Hi there, welcome everybody. This is our webinar on how to engage young voters in climate action for the upcoming federal election, and we're thrilled to have Grace Nosek here with us. I'd like to start off by acknowledging that we're on the unceded ancestral territory of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam people. With that, we'll get started. Every time I've met Grace or heard her present, I feel like I might end up with a kink in my neck from nodding so much. Her ideas and her perspectives are grounded in research and experience and really resonated with me. And that's why we are so excited to have her here with us today and to share with you. Before I introduce her, I'm Jody Stark, and I'm proudly part of the small but mighty Charged Up team here at the David Suzuki Foundation. Through Charged Up, we work with people from across Canada from all walks of life to accelerate the transition to renewable energy. Moving to renewables like solar, wind, geothermal, and biomass, and using that energy more efficiently are keys to reducing emissions, creating new jobs, diversifying our energy resources, and giving communities more control over the energy systems, and of course, protecting our climate. If you check out our webpage, there you go, there's the link to the web page. It's also in the chats. You'll get a dose of inspiration with so many stories of amazing things that people are doing and communities are doing across Canada. It warms my heart and gives me hope, so I hope it does the same for you. As a public engagement specialist, my job as part of the Charged Up team is to get people to take action to help with this transition off of fossil fuels and get people charged up with renewable energy. This involves advocacy actions as well as making changes in our own lives, our own homes, and our communities. So I'm working on some really exciting projects that you might be interested in hearing about when they're ready, including some training on how to have more constructive and less polarizing conversations about climate change, and on a matchmaking tool to connect people with the resources that they need to get involved in the renewable energy movement. So make sure to join the Charged Up community to hear more about these and other projects as they are released. And if you join, you might even get selected to have a sneak peek at our new products and tools before they get launched to help test and advise us. So yeah, just take a moment on that Join Charged Up link to join. So now on to what you're actually here for, Grace Nosek. Grace is a Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation scholar getting her PhD in law at the University of British Columbia and studying how to use law to protect climate change science from manufactured doubt. Grace has also studied at Rice University and Harvard Law School. Her research has been supported by a Fulbright Canada Fellowship, a Harvard Knox Memorial Traveling Fellowship, and a British Columbia Law Foundation Fellowship, among others. And then beyond academia, she's also written and published 3 novels in a hopeful climate fantasy series called Ava of the Gaia Trilogy. And she also created and hosts Planet Potluck, a podcast exploring stories of hope, joy, and community in the climate movement. Grace is a founding member of the UBC Climate Hub, and she has never met a dance party she didn't want to join. So I'll pass this over to her now, and if you have any questions during the presentation, please include them in the Q&A section, and we'll try to get them at the end. Welcome, Grace.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, Jody. And thank you also for that territory acknowledgement. And I'd just love to add that it's really important to remember that acknowledgement as we talk about climate change today. Indigenous peoples in Canada disproportionately bear the consequences of a warming world. They're also on the front lines of fighting the climate threat, both here and around the globe. And as we think about elections and government action, we know that to support climate justice, we have to support Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous language and Indigenous law. So Yeah, I love that introduction. That's wonderful. So I study how corporations manufacture uncertainty around climate change. So narratives are really kind of the bread and butter of what I do. And my master's in law focused on how climate litigation could draw from social science to effectively communicate with the public. So I've been fascinated with social science for many years. I've looked at how you can use it to engage folks on climate change, and I've also looked at how you can use it to get people to vote. But I am not myself a social scientist. I have also spent the last 5 or 6 years presenting to and talking to thousands and thousands and thousands of young people about climate change and climate justice. And so I kind of draw from my research, from the social science, and from all of those interactions to really try and put theory into practice on engaging the public in climate justice. And as Jody mentioned, I'm the student director of the UBC Climate Hub, which is a new student-led, university-wide initiative focusing on the power of story to successfully build climate community and engage and empower broad, diverse, and new audiences in climate action. And we have this really cool hybrid structure where we have a full-time staff and student staff, but the agenda is set by students and we're supported by university resources. And we've been doing some really exciting work. So you can also check out the UBC Climate Hub. So just to give you a sense of the outline for today's webinar, I'm briefly going to talk about youth election and climate change. Then I'm going to talk about 2 campaigns that I've been a part of on the election and on climate change that have been quite successful. And then we're going to move to key takeaways from those campaigns and kind of a timeline of engagement going forward on the election. So just to give us the context around youth election and climate change, there was just a newspaper article saying that Canadians between the ages of 18 and 38 will be more than 37% of the electorate in this coming election. So really kind of the biggest piece of the pie. And we also know that youth disproportionately care about climate change. Both Abacus Data and Insights West just released polls showing that young people rank climate as a higher priority than any other generation. And just as an example of that, 37% of millennials rank climate in their top 2 election issues, compared to 30% of Gen X and 25% of boomers. So you can really see this confluence that young people are going to be a huge part of the electorate and that they disproportionately care about climate. And then one other really interesting thing is that youth are one of the most socially engaged groups, even though historically people don't think of them as being the largest voting audience. In 2013, 74% of youth aged 15 to 19 and 64% of youth aged 20 to 24 were part of a group or organization, according to StatCan. And that's a really important statistic as I talk about some of the strategies that we've employed going forward. So the first campaign is called Voting Buddies, and I ran this with some friends at just like the most grassroots level. And it was based on some social science that we saw emerging from US elections and that kind of presidential campaigns had used really successfully in the US. So the social science has a couple of points for how you can engage voters and some simple nudges that can increase people's chances of voting. And that includes encouraging people to make a logistical plan. So have them articulate when, where, and how they will vote. Demonstrating to them that their community is voting. Engaging their personal accountability to follow through and vote, which you can do potentially through a pledge, or saying you'll check back in with them after the election to see how their voting process went. And also that being asked by someone they trust to vote is really important. And as you can see, I left some resources that kind of go over that social science according to voting up on the PowerPoint, and I believe they're showing up in chat. So we took this social science and we found it really interesting because there's been this conventional wisdom out there that, and I've seen this as a young person, totally people coming through and trying to encourage me to vote by saying, young people don't vote, you need to fix that, you need to be the ones who are voting. And that's actually what that does, is actually disempowers young people from voting, because what they hear is, oh, my peers don't vote, I'm not expected to vote, I won't get social censure for not voting. And so actually how we need to be communicating to young people and young voters is that their community is voting, that they are expected to vote, that there's a social norm that they should vote. And so we really tried to come up with a simple campaign that might help us communicate, draw from the social science, and increase voter turnout. And it's just very simple. So we got young people to find their voting buddy. And this is someone who would go to the polls with them, or help them with election day logistics, or hold them accountable to vote. And part of the inspiration for this is I actually have a voting buddy. And we just for years now have been these voting buddies for every level of election. We kind of just check in with each other and say, hey, like, let's go to the polls together. Let's make this social. Let's make this community. And we always just remind the other one and check in with that personal accountability that you've got to get to the polls. And that made voting for me this really social, beautiful thing where I would go with one of my best friends. And then instead of being this sacrifice, instead of being this hard thing I had to do in the day and get through all these logistics, it became a social outing that reaffirmed me and embedded me in my community. So we got people to take these selfies with their voting buddies. And then we got them to post their selfies to any form of social media they wanted and describe their voting plan. So say we're voting early at this location, or we're going to go together on election day and get a drink afterwards. And we really emphasized making the photos goofy, fun, and social, because that's something we've never really seen with voting. It's always framed as this incredibly serious thing that you have to do, or you know, people say like, pause a moment from all the fun things and let me tell you about voting. And I think that misses a chance to bring in an even wider audience and just make it something that your community does, and that's fun. And so we got these amazing goofy photos. And then the next step, which I think is a really important one, and it's kind of a theme throughout what I'll be talking about today, is that we went to youth leaders. So as I mentioned, a ton of young people, 3/4 of them are in some kind of group or organization. And that's outside of universities and inside of universities. But I've often been working from within universities because I've been in school, and there are just tons of groups. There are tons of ways that you can go to a whole bunch of young people at once, and where young people have already sorted themselves and have leaders in these specific ways. So the heads of issue groups, or the heads of fraternities and sororities, or the captains of athletic programs kind of already act as leaders in specific communities. And so we went to those leaders and we explained to them that they could really help get their peers out to vote. And so what we told them was that it's really important for young people to vote, because that's how the issues that we care about get represented. That's how governments respond to us. And we kind of asked them what issues they cared about, and talked about how voting might drive those. And then we also kind of showed them the social science that if you don't vote when you're young, you're less likely to vote when you're older. And so that they can actually be these key parts in making sure that we keep a vital, robust democracy. And we found that young people just really responded to that. They wanted to be leaders in democracy. And so we asked them to take voting buddies photos and share this information with their own communities, so that we weren't the ones coming in and being new, that it was actually these community leaders were already kind of getting their peers to get out and vote. And again, that whole point of showing young people that their community is voting, what better way to do that than actually go to the leaders of the community and have them participate in some visible way that they are going to vote, and that they're going to be doing it with other members of their community. And so we went to a lot of universities, it turns out, have varsity athletics like forums, so where all of the varsity captains come and meet together and discuss things. And so you can actually go and you can talk to every single varsity captain at a university at once. And we asked them to participate, and we got some amazing photos from all of these different teams. And of course, they're teams, so it's 5 or 6 people in a photo, kind of laughing together, having that voting buddies photo. And just again, showing voting in a way it's not often seen. Young people don't get to see it that way. And I just have some other examples of communities, but dorms usually have their own little like governments. There are student governments. These are all kind of university groups, but I can imagine kind of intramural athletics outside of university, faith groups. There's all kinds of groups where young people are congregating. So that was the Voting Buddies campaign. And what we found anecdotally was that the Voting Buddies photos were shared so much more than any other post about the election, and that they were liked so much more frequently, and people really engaged with them. And then we also found that after a few people had posted them, a lot of other people started to. And on voting, it's really kind of getting that sense of peer pressure, but positive peer pressure, really being able to tap into that sense that you're going to miss out if you don't participate in this. So I don't know if you've ever been in a place where they're having a blood drive and you see those stickers of people saying like, I donated, and you really feel that pull, like, okay, I need to do that because my community expects that from me. That's what a good person who's part of this community would do. And that's exactly kind of the sense that we need to give voting in these different communities. And that's one cool way to do it. So yeah, another campaign that, I've been working on, is the Climate Ambassadors Workshops. And this is something that the Climate Hub is running, and they've been really exciting so far. And this draws from research showing that vouchers, or what we could also call leaders, are critical to showing a community how their values align with climate action. So again, you can see the parallel with voting here, that to identify kind of these charismatic, trusted members of a community, and to identify communities that already kind of exist. And instead of waiting for them to come to us, going to those communities and empowering them. And so this idea was to kind of find densely networked social groups that might already have these trusted members of community and empower them to talk about climate change effectively. And some other things about vouchers or communication, the social science also says that tone matters when you're talking about climate change, and that respect and openness for others' views are a helpful way to kind of come into a community and talk about climate change. And so we have been piloting these workshops, and we've been starting with high school students. And again, like there's already this structure for high school students because you can go into a classroom that exists. But we've also been working with athletes at UBC, which has been really exciting. We again went to this like varsity council and told the varsity athletes that we really wanted to make a video about analogizing sports comebacks to climate comebacks, and that we would love to have kind of athletic leaders in that video. And we got an overwhelming response from athletes. What we really found is like that community was already ready to participate. Lots of the teams emailed me afterwards and said their team had already been talking about the UN report and wondering what they could do. But these are people who have really busy lives. They're juggling athletes and athletic and school, and they couldn't see an easy way in to working on climate. And so we went to them and we tailored the ask, and we gave them that entry point that was specifically tailored to their skills and their cares. And then that was all it took, like really giving them that easy place. And we got almost all teams to be a part of this, or some interest from almost all of the teams. And then the next one that we're doing that I'm really excited about, and we're gonna do ambassador workshops with athletes going forward in the fall. But we're also gonna do climate ambassador workshops for creatives and storytellers. So actors, models, filmmakers, dancers, poets, we're again finding that a lot of them are really interested in climate change, but don't necessarily know how to tell climate stories, and are worried about getting wrong, or worried about appearing hypocritical, and maybe don't know as much about climate justice or some of these other things, or systemic climate action. So what does the workshop content look like when we have these workshops? We always, again, as I said, tailor them to the individual community that we go to, but these are kind of the pieces that we're always working with. So we bring up the newest UN report that kind of gave us 12 years to prevent climate catastrophe, because it's just, I think, a helpful frame for groups who aren't already right in the thick of the movement to really understand how urgently we need to act. The other thing that we do that we haven't seen a lot of other groups do is really validate people's climate emotions. We always open with a space for people to talk about how they feel about climate and what comes to mind. And we find, for high school students especially, that they just love being able to hear their peers and know that they're also scared, and they just really like having their emotions validated. A key part of the workshops and kind of all of the work that the Climate Hub does is making sure that we're coming from a climate justice lens, and making sure that people understand climate change as a justice issue. So we define climate justice, and we help students think about this as a human rights issue. And that sounds kind of basic, but I was just in a high school last week, and none of the 50 students knew what climate justice was when I was presenting. So again, this is a message that we aren't seeing spread as much as some other messages. People are still thinking of kind of polar bears and melting ice caps, rather than kind of all the folks living at the margins who are already suffering so much and who will be suffering so much with climate change. The other thing we do is we always share our personal stories, and that's been like really helpful in building trust with a community. Kind of, we make ourselves vulnerable, and we open ourselves up because we understand that the message is almost less important than who's giving the message, and that this group is really going to have to trust us if they're going to listen to the message. And we also, through telling that story, kind of can tell how we've found hope on climate change, how we found a place for ourselves, how we found kind of meaning and purpose and friends. We talk about how industry has undermined climate narratives. That's a really helpful context for people to understand why storytelling and salience are so important, and how they can have such a big effect on climate if they just become storytellers. So of course, this is something I study, and I'm imagining most of you know, but there's very clear evidence emerging that many fossil fuel industry members and their kind of trade group representatives have been involved in a very comprehensive, intense plan to undermine climate action, climate policy, the will to act on climate. And by giving that context to groups, we can make storytelling, we can make talking about climate narratives really important and really salient. And students can start understanding how being storytellers, talking to their friends and family about climate, pushing back against some of these industry narratives, is a really powerful way to act on climate. And then what that naturally leads into is we focus that we talk to people about how you can move beyond individual action on climate change. And again, this is something we find that no one is really making the connection with yet in high schools and in some of these other communities. When we ask what climate action looks like, it's often composting, recycling, reducing plastic waste. And the social science backs this up, that this is what people kind of associate with environmental citizenship. And so again, we're trying to broaden what it looks like, climate action. And so we draw out that climate action is also voting on climate. It's getting others to vote on climate. It's calling representatives about climate change and making proposals to governments for climate action and holding governments accountable. And then again, just this really simple but incredibly important point of just talking to your friends and family members. And that's such a beautiful entry point for everyone into climate action. People can't really see how they can take these tangible steps, but if you can flip that over and show them how being storytellers, that truly everyone can be this climate ambassador and climate storyteller, and that they all have a community that they can talk to about it, and that's so important. It really resonates with people that this is a way they can act on climate. And so then we also always show examples of someone from whatever group that we're presenting to, how they've acted on climate. So if it's young people, we show how young people are already doing this. And especially effective is that we find someone in the room who's actually willing to share their story, and so that their peers can hear them. So we had this amazing group of teens who worked with the Climate Hub, and they decided that they wanted to make a video for how to call for young people, for how to call their reps on climate change. And then what they did is they called their reps, and they got really excited about it. And then they started to get their friends calling their reps. And so when we went back and did our follow-up workshop, we had one of these teens talk about the experience of calling her representative and what it felt like and how scared she was, and then how empowering it was after she was done, and how now she's been calling back, and now she's been emailing and demanding a meeting, and her peers were mesmerized. And I've now heard from other ones that they've been calling, and I heard one of the students say, I heard him say to the teen who presented, and it was so cute, he was like, that really shook me. I'm shook. And you could just see how that really resonates. And so definitely, if you can, what we've been trying to do then is give our initial climate ambassador workshops to all teens, but then have a smaller group of the teens who are interested and kind of connect them to each other. And then if those teens are willing, to have them speak when we talk to other classrooms at their school. So just always thinking about how you can identify people who other people will identify with on climate change. And then of course, we always have the groups in our workshops brainstorm what action they could take and how they can bring their own skill set and do something on climate change. And we get amazing ideas, which I will share at least one of those with you later on. But truly, people come up with such creative ways, and they really like when they're asked to do it by drawing on their own skills, right? If they're a musician, or if they're a singer, or if they're a poet, and we say, well, do that, do climate in that way. What would you do? And then we get songs and poems, and it's, again, framing climate as not a sacrifice, but actually a way to live your best life. That this is how you can like take your skills and expand on them and create stories that you can share with your community. And people really, really respond to that. So some of the key takeaways, which I've kind of already hit on, but just the overarching ones that I've seen from both of these campaigns and just the work that we've done, is that youth from across communities are already deeply concerned about climate change. And I'm not even talking about the usual suspect communities. I'm truly talking about anywhere we go. The young people are already ready. They're already worried, and they want to be a part of the solution. So for some of those groups, though, as I mentioned it and before, they need the explicit ask to come in. They are worried about climate, but they don't know how it connects to what they're already doing, and they don't see how they can be a leader in the movement or how they're important to the movement. And when you go to them and not wait for them to come to you, and you tell them how they can be important and how they can bring their skills, it's just the sky's the limit. We've also found that peer-to-peer presentation is really important. We are young people presenting to other young people. And they really feel like they can trust us. And those personal stories that we tell really resonate because we're not much further along than they are. But not just youth, like when we have our climate ambassador workshops, we make sure we're going to have athletes present to the climate space. And we're going to have creatives present to creatives. And again, just drawing from that social science, that leaders in community are critical to showing that community how their values align with climate action. We've also found that emphasizing and modeling fun, joy, hope, welcome, community in the climate sphere has been really powerful. So two things on that. I think it can be a hard tone to strike because we really want to honor justice in this conversation, and we want to recognize that people are already devastated by climate change. Folks living at the margin are already suffering immensely, and that will only get worse. And so I can see for some people why it would be hard to strike that tone. And then the other thing that we often hear is that, isn't hope too much? Isn't it overdone? Like, doesn't that seem naive, or, you know, not paint the full picture? But we're talking to young people who are already terrified. When we poll them, 90% of them think about climate change at least once a week. Most of them think about it every day, and they feel helpless about it. That's like a mental health crisis waiting to happen. And so when that's our audience, we go with hope. But of course, we're also presenting the UN report. We're also talking about justice. So we're not giving a one-note presentation of hope that everything will be okay, that this is fine. What we're saying is, this is scary and hard and complex, and people are really hurting. But you can come to this, there's still a chance, and you can make friends, and you can lean in together with a community who wants to take this on. And just, we find that we have no capacity to take all the volunteers who want to come when we frame it that way. People so rarely hear that there's a chance, or that they're important, or that they're welcome, that we just, yeah, we have, it's been such a successful message. And we kind of think of ourselves sometimes as the Gryffindor common room in the climate fight, because, you know, no one doesn't want to go to Hogwarts because Voldemort is there, right? People still want to go and have that camaraderie and that joy together facing this threat. And so that's kind of what we try to model, that there is this threat, that people are suffering, but we're going to lean into this together, and that you can really find meaning in a world where people are scared and anxious and lonely. And so one really tangible way of doing that is that we always have a dance party at the end of our events, no matter the topic. We just find it a really beautiful way to kind of end and bond a community, and make people feel like this is a space that they want to be in, that it's not like a sacrifice to come to. And then this point that people really want to feel important and like they're being taken seriously. I have gotten so many texts and emails from high school students especially, just saying, thank you for making us feel important. Thank you for making us feel like we matter. Thank you for treating us like adults. And just that phrasing over and over again. And so really thinking about how we can go into different communities and make them feel important in this fight. And then use organizational structures that already exist. I just think for young people, 75% of young people are in a group, an organization, or a community. So if you're gonna spend time getting out the vote or trying to engage folks on climate, there's these amazing spaces that already exist that you can go to and really be able to talk to a lot of people at once, and really be able to tailor your presentation to their concerns. So yeah, we've tried to just stop having events that just invite people to us, because you just get the same people in the room, and there's a reason for doing that. But we're really thinking about bringing ourselves to new audiences and new places. Yeah, and then just some key takeaways on just actual communications. As I said, one of the coolest things that we've seen is that embedding voting in this sense of community, making it a social action, not just an individual one, is really powerful. And voting is a social thing, right? We're voting for the community and the world that we want to see. But it's never framed in that way, because I guess you go into the voting booth alone. But yeah, just thinking about how we can really embed this into a social community feel. And then just putting theory into practice. So if what you shouldn't do is tell young people that young people don't vote and they should fix it, what are some things that you could say? And you could say something like, this could be the highest youth turnout ever. Youth are leading the climate voting conversation. Yeah, points like that. So with all of that in mind, what can you start doing now to kind of get ready for the election? And some of these points will be tailored towards universities, because that's, again, kind of where I'm working out of, so I'm most familiar. But obviously, lots of young people are not at universities, so thinking about broader outreach will be important. But one of the first things I think will be really helpful for any organization is start to find those people who can deliver peer-to-peer communications. And they're out, like, they want to be involved. Again, now we have these high school students, and we have more high school volunteers that we know what to do with, and they all really want like a tangible way to get involved. So I know there are a ton of young people who want to step up on climate. So they're out there. And the other thing, as you're kind of thinking about who can deliver that peer-to-peer communication, you can start aggregating all the youth organizations in your area. What are all the different groups you could go to and could you talk to, and what's the contact list that looks like? And then you can connect young people to each other. This is something that the hub is really trying to do, right? The point is that if we take a little bit of the administrative burden off of university and high school students, they can take their energy and their passion and their numbers and their fresh eyes and just run with things. And so we we've been giving these climate ambassador workshops, and then we've been following up by connecting the teens most interested in climate action and climate justice to one another. And so we find the supervisor, we find the space, we set the time, and then we get all of the contact info for all the teams and then give it to each other. So we kind of seed this group of people who can act. And one of the coolest ideas that came out of just connecting and supporting youth was this idea teens have to go to PACs, to go to kind of the parent-teacher organizations at schools and tell them how nervous they are about climate change, how much of a mental health issue it's becoming for them and their peers, and how much they want to work with older generations to think about climate action. And they're hoping to do at least one of those this fall, and some of the teens said they're going to make a video filming all their peers talking about why they're so scared of climate and what they would like to see for their future to show at PACs. So amazing ideas coming from young people when we just kind of give them the administrative support to meet with one another and then think about how they would actually put their ideas into action. I think it's really important to begin drawing the connection between climate action and voting. As I said, almost no one that we talk to initially makes that jump on climate action being voting, getting other people to vote, calling your representative. They're still firmly kind of, for years and decades, they've been entrenched in this idea that environmental action and climate action is recycling and reducing plastic. And so I don't know if that looks like an op-ed. I do know that every event that you're kind of putting on, people will ask you what is tangible action they can take, or you can end every event that you're putting on. And I think you can reference that one of the most important things that you can do is vote. And one of the other most important things you can do is get other people to vote, so that we're really drawing that systemic connection and making it really clear before the election. And then potentially you could hold your own climate ambassador workshops. We at the Hub are trying to develop a model that other people could replicate, but you could take any of that content and go to a group and say that you'd like to tell them a bit more about climate change or climate justice or systemic action or what they could do. And I'm pretty sure you'd have a receptive audience. Especially interesting is potentially engaging with creatives, thinking about the stories they can tell and how there's still really a dearth of pop culture stories talking about climate justice, the connection between climate change and voting. And that if you could support groups like that and connect them to each other, that we could help tell those stories. Registering young voters now will be really important. There's social science that says that's like a big hurdle and barrier for young people. And again, you could make this social. You could hold parties for young voters to register them. But obviously, if young voters are registered, they will get more information on when, where, and how to vote. And especially we see for university students, immense confusion about this because they're not sure where their residency is. And so then they're not sure where they can vote. And then as they move around, they don't always get the information to the right address. So big issue there. Yeah, and then this is more specifically tailored, I guess, to universities and things that we've seen firsthand, but I think now is the time to check in with university officials and student governments and see what their plans are for student engagement in the election, because it's coming up soon and those plans need to be in place. And there's a ton of things that universities can do to support youth voter engagement. Obviously, it's more powerful for students to be making those asks from their universities. We're definitely going to be making these asks, but one thing that we've seen is that Ontario university presidents have taken this election pledge. If you're kind of somewhere and you're looking for what it might look like for a university to support civic engagement, and this pledge says that the presidents will support the dissemination of information on electoral participation, that they'll facilitate the availability of voting stations at accessible campus locations, that they'll encourage campus-based groups that promote student voting and address barriers to student participation, and that they'll provide a progress update at least every 4 years. And that's interesting because I think some people shy away from asking universities to support civic engagement because it feels political in some way, and it's just not. And universities around the world have signed these pledges and stepped up and think that it's like a critical role that they play to support democracy, to support their students to vote. And so I think we can ask universities to do that and hold them accountable to that vision. So some other things that universities can do, can ask professors to give credit for assignments related to Youth Get Out the Vote in the fall. And there's this amazing project that it happened in 2013, I haven't seen it replicated, but Emily Carr worked with Elections BC on this Designing for Democracy project. And so it was these young artists came up with different nonpartisan campaign tools to get their peers to vote. And I see that as being such a cool way to engage. If we get young artists to use some of the social science principles and think about how to engage their peers on voting, how powerful that could be. So check that out. There's a bunch on the web, Designing for Democracy. You can learn a bit more about that model. But just think about it. Young artists have communities and they want to share their work with their communities. They're looking for ways to practice their work. So if they are commissioned to do something around the election, they will already have a community they'll want to share it with. And they also know what motivates their peers. So cool way to think about telling stories to get out the vote. And then you can also ask, it's really important that universities send school-wide emails giving the logistics about voting and have social media posts around election logistics. That's part of the best practices for what universities can do. One of the coolest things that I'm really interested in is all universities kind of have these internal systems where their students can log in and kind of have their housing, their financial, all of these other things. And it's time that universities really start putting voting and registration info in that school intranet. And so people have been asking for their universities to do that. And we're also seeing that British universities have been piloting to allow students to just register through that system. That might be a harder ask, but thinking about how we can use these systems to really allow students to participate. Democracy, some other things that schools have done are hold 24-hour policy discussions before elections with issues relevant to students. And then another best practice is to give students the day off to participate in the election or get out the vote without penalty. And then another thing that I think we can all be doing now in preparation for the election is highlight industry influence over the election. Tell this story over and over because it's underseen, it's poorly understood, and it will really help the public kind of, I think, be able to think critically about where narratives are coming from. And I made a video using a Game of Thrones parallel to try and kind of tell this story really quickly and accessibly about how this industry narrative has influenced elections for a really long time and policy and what we can do to push back against that. So just moving into the last slide, what can we do in September or October? So I think it's so important to go to university and high school classrooms to get students to register and to give them nonpartisan information, logistical information. That's where students are. It's incredibly time efficient to go to them when they're in these classrooms of 200 people and you have their undivided attention. And we've seen a group at Austin, at the University of Texas in Austin, did this in the 2018 US election. They just got students to go to classrooms and give nonpartisan voting information. They had the highest voter turnout in decades for university students. Also, you could roll out your own version of a Voting Buddies campaign on social media. I think it's especially the sweet spot is probably like 3 or 4 weeks out and then closing in on the election, but really saturating social media with that sense that people are voting and that they're doing it with their community. And then I would kind of in September start going to university and high school leaders and telling them how they can encourage their own communities to vote, and ask them to participate in something like Voting Buddies, or to just be giving information to their peers and kind of holding that up. And again, just like people really like feeling like they can be leaders on an issue. If you go to them and you say the social science says that you can be the leader on this issue, that you can be a critical part in restoring democracy and making this a vital democracy, people are like, yes, okay, I can be that. That reinforces my identity as someone who can be a positive force in society. And then hosting youth-focused texting and calling get out the vote parties for those folks who are more engaged, because you have to work at a lot of levels, right? You have to bring in new people, but for those people who are already really interested, how do we support them in doing even more? And making these like parties, I really think that's like the key. Make this fun. Your friends are going to be there. There's going to be food. You can call if you want to, but if you don't want to call, you can text. And then when we're at these parties, what we tell people is actually the most important thing you can do is talk to your friends and family first. So it's great to call strangers and to call people in your community, and that's amazing, and we want you to do that. But even before that, you have immense influence over your family and friends. And so thinking about how to work that into your campaign to get people to start talking to their friends and family. And I saw a lot of interesting ways that people were doing that in the 2018 US midterm elections. That social science really seems to have permeated. But if you're hosting young people in any sense, really letting them know that they have this power over that community. So yeah, that is pretty much the end. I had one last piece. I was just looking through some climate communications material. And just one last interesting piece is that, if I can find it in my notes, which maybe I cannot, just some interesting frames for climate that are really effective and are good entry points for a lot of audience are talking about extreme weather events, increasing momentum for clean energy, and having a health frame. And there's lots more that you can think about and learn about there, but there's just some really cool stuff emerging from the social science that tells us how we can be effective communicators to new and different audiences. Great, so questions.
Wow, thank you. I was thinking of trying to do a quick summary before we went to questions, but there was so much there. I think for me, the main takeaway, and this is something admittedly, oh yeah, let's make sure we get me on the microphone. We'll share the microphone now. One of the things I think I'm sure other people struggle with as well is around this, as someone who works full-time in climate advocacy, is just around this like real, the heaviness of the issue, the seriousness of the issue. And every time we see Grace, it's always that reminder of just really how important it is to embrace the fun, the sense of community, the joy, and to make sure we're partying. So that's one of my kind of take homes. And And then also, as you know, a lot of my colleagues, we have a lot more gray hair than we probably should, going and speaking to the universities directly, but really thinking about how we can partner with young people. We have a lot of young volunteers, get young people on contract. So so we're letting that real peer-to-peer experience come through, and really biting our tongues when resisting that strong desire to give people all of the information that we know to make change, because that idea of you know, we know that stories, sharing emotions, allowing them to share their emotions, to be heard, is really, really important. We're in discussions, and I'm sure others are often approached by artists of different stripes who want to be a part of the climate movement, and I think figuring out how to incorporate every different type of art, all the different, like meeting people where they're at. So like, and not just artists, the same as Grace was talking about, like the varsity students, but not trying to do so by coming with our ideas and imposing them, but actually trying to meet them where they're at, so so that their voices are heard, and their yeah, that what their values in their communities are being properly kind of represented. One thing that I thought of, and then we'll move to some questions, is around, I can't remember which election it was, but I know there were some bands that went to go play at voting polls, so while people are waiting in line, so turning that voting thing into like an experience. So that's one thing that we can encourage, you know, musicians, go to turn voting day into a fun day.
I love that.
Yeah, there was a donut company, I think it was on Ontario, that, you know, was like, oh, if you show up between noon and 2, we'll you know, we'll have free donuts for everyone. So just really trying to encourage all of the people that we liaise with to contribute in their own way, not just about telling people vote for climate change, but actually just turning voting into a fun thing. Yeah. So yeah, so I'll go through some of the questions. So we have a question that says, what can the youth do at grassroots when leaders of this country, sorry, I just realized we have to be careful. We're not allowed to be partisan, so I'm just reading this carefully before we go on. So what can youth do at grassroots when leaders of this country make rash decisions, such as tripling Canada's oil production, and say that it's all in the natural interest? Civil disobedience, stop paying taxes, go on hunger strikes. There must be a direct way to hold our leaders accountable and bring them down when they do things that don't make a lot of common sense. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Do you want to start, or?
Well, I think some of what I'm hearing from Grace that really resonates with me is trying to, in these moments, really, like, we're talking about voting, we're talking about how students, or how young people can elevate this, and part of it is tapping into that joy. So this sense that about how urgent and severe everything is real. It's very real. And also, if we're looking to make sure that we're bringing young people in and are going to be sustainable, we want to create a movement that is going to have some staying power. That part of it is to have parties.
Yeah, I think, where do you want to be? Like, what draws you to a space? And like, when you think about that, like, I go to things because my friends are there and I'm like, it's a chance for me to be with them. And I go when I think there will be music and there will be a vibe. And so really leaning into that. But I think calling representatives is a really interesting place to start. Still, we hear from politicians that they don't hear very much from their constituents. When the young people I know call, they often get through to their representatives because it's quite unusual for a high schooler to be calling. And then I always love the generative effect, right? So try something, and then get your friends to do it, and then come up with a story to get other people to do it. And so that's what we're seeing the teens that we work with do. They called first their representative, then they made a film how to get other people to call their representative, and now they're writing a proposal that they're going to take to all their different representatives and get a bunch of their peers to take it. And so I just love that really generative building block that, again, is social, and that's, I think, where organizations can really support and help with some of the administrative support behind organizing those meetings, providing space to young people, etc.
Thank you. So we have a question that, as a professor, should I be careful about directing this information to my class?
No, I mean, this is a nonpartisan webinar. The Climate Hub does nonpartisan work. Universities are now encouraging professors to tell their classes about voting logistics. And yeah, I think that is all well within your purview to share with your class. And it's really interesting that climate change, people are so nervous of even coming to the edges of talking about climate because it's been politicized. But that was a very deliberate tactic by a small group of people who made it a political issue. And so not allowing ourselves to be so scared, it's not a political issue in most ways. Talking about climate change and saying that we need government action, that's not a political statement.
Thank you. So we have a question, is it public knowledge who voted in Canada? That in the US, there's been research that shows it works that to get people out to vote when the public record is, when it's made public about who voted, and to remind people that elected officials only care about the people who vote. My understanding is that that isn't publicly available in Canada. I don't know if you know more about that.
I don't. I come from an American background, and I do know that's one of the real nudges that they use when they contact voters. They say, you are a past voter. And it's really interesting. It turns out that saying you're a voter rather than you voted actually links voting to your intrinsic identity. And that like leans into the noble aspect of being a voter and also makes someone feel like, oh, this is part of my identity, I will vote going forward. So even just that difference between the noun and the verb, saying something like you voted versus you are a voter. And then people do look at the records and say, you were a voter in the past, or we counted on you to be a voter in the past. But also, as I said, there's this other nudge, 2 nudges where you can ask someone to publicly pledge that they will vote. And you can also say something like, I might follow up with you and see how your voting experience was. And those both work as nudges for folks to really feel like they're a voter and feel like there's that social pressure that they should vote.
Great, thank you. There are more questions in the Q&A that unfortunately we're not going to have time to get to, but thank you to those who contributed them. We're at time. I feel like we can go on for a lot longer. Really appreciate everyone who participated and stayed, and of course to Grace for sharing this information with us. We'll be sharing this with everyone who participated as well as those who were registered. So look for an email from me about that. And yeah, we look forward to Election Day as it gets close, and all the parties that are going to happen across the country now. Thanks, Grace.
Thank you.